Hello, and thank you for participating in today's presentation. This is the Client Enrichment Series group. And just so as a reminder, we are recording this session. Hello and good day, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's edition of the Client Enrichment Series. Before we begin, I want to inform you that we are recording today's session, and we'll post that recording on the gsa.gov site as well as our YouTube channel. If you would not like to participate in this recorded session, you are welcome to leave the webinar and view the recording once it is posted. Would also like to mention that we do have closed captioning services within this presentation. This is located on your toolbar to enable. My name is James Fotopoulos, and I will be your host today. I'm a regional account manager from PBS Region 6 out of Kansas City, and it's my pleasure to participate in today's presentation. More importantly, I'm your host of this series today called RWA Policy and Process Fundamentals. Here's a little bit about our presenters. Laura Beth Hawkins is a program analyst with the Reimbursable Services Center for Customer Delivery Office of Project Delivery. She started her career with GSA in 2004, starting with the Region 6 Finance Office, where she handled the formulation execution of the reimbursable budget. It was at this time that she joined and helped create the RWA national team in developing the program into what it is today. She is from Kansas City as well, and where she lives, she has 5 dogs and also a husband. Jesse Perugine is a program analyst in the Center for Customer Delivery, specifically working with the reimbursables program. Jesse came to the central office from Region 8, where he was a construction project manager working on mostly lease projects. His experience varied from small renovations to complex new space. Prior to his work as a construction project manager, Jesse worked as a leasing specialist for 3 years. He grew up in New York on Long Island and relocated to Golden, Colorado in 2015. Him and his wife and him, recently welcomed their first child in 2021. In his spare time, Jesse enjoys running local trails and cooking and gardening. Before I turn it over, we have a few housekeeping items. We've automatically muted your audio to help us control the sound quality of the presentation. So rather open up the presentation to verbal questions. We're asking you to put those questions in the Q&A pod, and those will be answered throughout the presentation. I emphasize there is also a chat pod in the area for Zoom. You can, if you have any issues with sound quality, you're not able to see us, you can put those questions in the chat pod. So we've got a couple of polling questions that we're going to start with to kind of get a feel for the audience. So here we go. Which of the following roles best describe your involvement with the RWA process? So you've got a couple of selections there: project manager, contracting officer, building project portfolio manager, budget finance manager, fund certifying official, or other. And if it's other, please specify in the chat pod. All right, we're going to go ahead and end that poll and show the results. And it looks like a third is a project manager, followed by contracting officer. We'll go to the next polling question. So what access do you currently have in eReada? Data entry user, read-only user, or I do not have an eReada user ID. Okay, we'll go ahead and close that poll out. And it looks like about close to 50% of you are data entry users, followed by read-only users. So, don't have an eReada user ID. So we've got a couple folks that are not familiar with the READA application, which is great. That's why you're here, to get a little bit of information for RWAs. And we also, as a reminder, do have e-RETA sessions throughout the year as well, if you want to get more information on the system specifically. So we'll stop sharing those results. And we are going to move on to the presentation. So I'll turn it over to our presenters. Oh, there we go.
All right, thank you, James, so much. And thank you guys for answering those poll questions because it really helps us to do this presentation and know who our audience is. So thank you for that. Jesse and I are excited to bring you this training today on the RWA policy and process. And we're hoping that in this training, you'll learn something new, understand some insights in why, we do business the way we do. So this screen here is our agenda. So as we venture into the land of RWAs here, we're going to start with some basics. We're going to cover some policies, some of the laws that affect this program and what governs what we do, basically. From there, we're going to venture into the project and process part of the RWAs, kind of, how we flow through the process of, your acceptance, your execution and closure. And finally, we will end with some good to know information, i.e. some contacts, some websites, in the future. If you guys have any questions or anything, we're going to provide all that information on where you go for the specific questions. So with that said, let's start into this training. Let's start with the basics here. Now, I know most of you already know these basics, so it's probably going to be kind of boring, but we're going to go ahead and go through these. Your first is, what is an RWA? Well, first of all, RWA stands for a reimbursable work authorization. What is a reimbursable work authorization? Well, it is GSA's Form 2957, and it is the OMB approved interagency agreement, otherwise known as the acronym IAA. You guys in your agencies might be familiar with that, but that is what it is. It's basically our contract where your agency comes to us and says, hey, GSA, we need some work done. And GSA agrees to do the work. It's what documents that work in between your agency and us. So now that we've kind of talked about RWAs and what this is, let's flip to the next slide and let's get into some of the appropriations law. So these are the laws that govern why we do what we do, basically. And some of these laws are incorporated in the policy, but we're just going to go through and we're going to start with the actual laws that we have to follow, basically. So first off is the funding authority that GSA uses to provide these services to you. Every agency has different funding authorities. These are the particular funding authorities that GSA might use when we are performing reimbursable work. PBS has 3 different funding authorities that we might use. And what authority is used all depends on the type of work, the project, the location, whole 9 yards there. So let's kind of dig into this a little further. Let's talk about the Federal Buildings Fund. The Federal Buildings Fund is the most common funding authority that GSA will use when performing reimbursable services for your agency. It is for work and or services that are performed in a building that is within the GSA's jurisdiction, custody, or control. So most of the reimbursable work that PBS provides does fall under this authority because most of the work that we do is a building that's within our jurisdiction, custody, or control. So the next funding authority we might use is the construction of buildings, 40 USC 583, basically, otherwise known as. So when does GSA actually use this particular funding authority? Well, like I said before, your type of funding authority depends on location and everything. GSA will use construction of buildings for any reimbursable work that is in a location that is outside of GSA's jurisdiction, custody, or control. Meaning it's a building that's not in GSA's inventory. We don't own the building. Your agency owns the building. So if a reimbursable request has come in and it involves construction, PBS would use the construction of buildings, the 583. So that's the only stipulation with using it, is it can only be used if it's if it's involved with the construction of a particular building. So renovation or anything, we can fall underneath that. So the beauty of the construction of buildings is the re-obligational authority, basically. And I apologize, I forgot to mention this on the Federal Buildings Fund. With the Federal Buildings Fund, once GSA, we have the signed RWA, the fully accepted RWA from you guys, that funding authority does not require us to re-obligate that funding prior to your funding expiration. So that's important to note there, because you might be using an annual funding source, the appropriation that expires on September 30th, but GSA doesn't have to do the re-obligation of it by September 30th. It's the same case for the construction of buildings. It is for work, like I said, outside of our jurisdiction, custody, or control, but we don't have to re-obligate prior to that funding expiring. So the last funding authority that GSA might use is the Economy Act, or 31 USC 1535. It is like construction of buildings. It will be used when GSA, we are helping you with some work that is outside of our jurisdiction, custody, or control. So we don't own that building. It's not in our building inventory or anywhere. That's when we'll use the Economy Act, but it can be used for everything. It can be used for construction, but it can be used for anything else that's not construction related. However, the caveat to this one, or of working with the Economy Act, is it does require that the funding get re-obligated by GSA prior to your agency's funding expiration. So that is a little hiccup there. So say you used an annual fund, GSA, the work that we're doing, we would have to obligate against that RWA prior to that September 30th deadline. All right, so now that we've talked about this, let's go to the next one. Jesse, if you go to the next slide, please. Let's talk about appropriations law and scope. So what governs us when we're talking about scope and everything? Well, the first is your documentary evidence, or your 31 USC 1501. It's just that. It's the requirement for a signed contract for us to perform the work for your agency, which, like I said before, is an RWA. An RWA is our contract. Is the official document that's signed that says, hey, we are going to do this work for you. Not only that, but it also documents the work to be performed. So it's important when we accept RWAs, and this is why we have it in our policy too, that we have to have that clear scope. We have to have that clear scope of the work that we're going to perform for your agency. We've got the documentary evidence that within that, which is your RWA, has to have that clear scope, because then we fall into the next one, which is 31 USC 1301, your use of funds. This is another thing that governs the business of why we do what we do. This particular law governs that you can only use those funds for their intended purposes. So whatever you identified on that RWA is the only thing GSA can use towards the project. We can't fund other stuff. It's only for that particular purpose. So let me kind of give you an example here. Let's say your agency submitted an RWA to GSA to recarpet and repaint rooms A, B, and C. Fine and dandy, the RWA comes into GSA, all the signatures are on it, it's fully accepted. So once that's fully accepted, the RWA can only be used to recarpet and repaint those particular rooms. If your agency, let's just say your agency comes back next year because we got the work done in rooms A, B, and C, but maybe there's some residual funding out there, and your agency comes back and says, hey, we got this residual funding. We want to do the same thing, but can we do it to room D? Your answer is going to be no to that one. And that is because the RWA originally came in for the intended purposes of just doing a renovation to room A, B, and C. So basically with the use of funds, we can only, I'm sorry, I lost my word there. With the use of funds, we have to have the intentions, because that's all GSA can do. The example I gave you is actually a common example that we do get questions from you guys and of other agency. You know, can we use this residual funding? Oh, hey, we need to do work over here. The reason why GSA tells you no is because of this, the use of funds and that law that governs it. So I just want to take this one step further. This is going to be in some other slides down, but let's take this one step further for scope additions, because basically adding room D to that particular RWA would be a scope addition to that RWA. If it's past the fiscal year of acceptance, we can't do it. But I just kind of wanted to add in here because I know some people are probably going to be asked this question in the chat to my team members here. What if we were added room D in the same year that you accepted the RWA? Your answer to that's going to be yes. Policy does allow scope additions to the RWA within the fiscal year of acceptance. So maybe you sent an RWA, you sent that RWA in December for rooms A, B, and C for fiscal year 24, current fiscal year. We fast forward to now, and now you want room D done. You can amend the RWA in this situation to add room D and either add money to it, or maybe there is residual funding, there is enough money to cover room D, that's fine and dandy. Policy does allow you to do it only within the fiscal year of acceptance of that RWA. All right, so now let's go into the next fun part of this laws and everything. Let's talk about appropriations law and timing. So this is another important factor here of why we do what we do. The first is your bona fide need. So 31 USC 1502 basically says we cannot accept money for work and or services without that bona fide need in place. You can't come to us and say, hey, GSA, we think we want some work done. We're just not quite sure yet, but we got the funding now. So let's go ahead and I just want to give you this money now. No, not without a bona fide need. Bona fide need is very important. Like I said, we cannot, accept it without that bona fide need in place. I'm going to provide you an example on this one because this is a question we've had before. So I'm trying to find common questions that have came through to us before. So maybe you have a new employee. The new employee is not going to start until December. And the new employee has an office and the employee doesn't come on till December. So you don't know if they're going to want to do any changes to the office, maybe some new carpet, new paints, whatever. So you come to us and say, hey, we got this new employee coming in. We want to send you some money to do some work in their office, but we're not sure what we want done yet, or even if that particular new employee is going to want any work done. Your answer is going to be no, because you don't have that bona fide need until that employee comes into place in December, or you have the knowns of what the employee is going to want done to that office, if anything. So I just want to kind of provide you some examples along the way of, like I said, commonly asked questions with us and everything. So now let's flip over, or not flip to the next. Let's talk about the Anti-Deficiency Act, the 31 USC 1341. The Anti-Deficiency Act does not allow the government to spend more than available for the obligation. So this is why PBS cannot perform reimbursable work without an accepted RWA. By doing so, GSA goes ahead and performs the work, and then your agency comes and pays us after the fact. That would be a violation of the Anti-Deficiency Act. So for leasing RWAs, providing you an example out here, this is why GSA requires an RWA prior to the lease award if an estimate prior to that lease award confirmed the costs were going to exceed that TI allowance. So with the lease award, even though we're not obligated to the lessor yet, PBS would still be anti-deficient without that funding in place, because by that signed lease award, you have a signed bona fide need there. So it's a project that we're going to enter into. So we have to have it prior to lease award if it's identified. However, I want to let you know, if you're doing a lease award and the estimate done prior to it shows that your costs were not going to exceed that TI allowance, then it is not a requirement for GSA to collect an RWA from your agency. only if we show those costs are going to go above and beyond your tenant improvement allowance. So what happens then, say lease was awarded in last year, fiscal year 23. Fast forward to this year, and it looks like some costs went up because there's some slight changes in the design and everything. And now it will exceed your tenant improvement allowance. That's fine. GSA will then ask your agency to submit an RWA for that overage. But because your bona fide need was established in fiscal year 23, the funding for that RWA would need to be 23, even though we're in 24. So I just want to kind of give you some examples out there of, why we do what we do. All right, so let's flip to the next slide. Okay, let's talk appropriations law, the delivery and changes. Basically, it's your period of availability for the execution of the project. So your agency has sent GSA and RWA to perform some work and or services for you. It's been fully accepted, which means signatures from your agency and from GSA have been applied. So once that occurs, the period of availability, it's quite simple. The funding is available for 5 years till the end of that fiscal year of the expiration date of the funding that your agency provided. So that goes for everything. When your agency makes that obligation on the books for that RWA that you submitted to GSA and acceptance, that's when that clock starts ticking, because that particular funding you used has 5 years to the end of the fiscal year of that expiration date to execute the project. And so it all depends on when that funding expires. So let's go into that a little bit and talk about the actual funding types out there. So if we can flip to the next slide, please. We have 3 basically. You either have an annual appropriation, a multi-year appropriation, or a no-year appropriation. Most agencies actually will have multiple types of that, but those are the type of appropriations out there. Annual appropriation is just like it is. It will expire. It is only good for that fiscal year. So it will expire on September 30th of that fiscal year. A multi-year could have a 2, 3, 5 year period of availability for new obligational purposes. It's not going to expire on September 30th, but maybe, it's a 2-year appropriation that your agency was issued this year. So it's 24-25, which means it's not going to expire until fiscal year, until September 30th of 2025. And then you also have your no year, which is indefinite. There's never an expiration date on that for new obligational purposes. It can keep going. So let's take this a step further and I just want to show you a chart here of the period of availability to try to tie back this types to the period of availability. So in the next slide here, we have an example of an annual appropriation basically. So this shows it's fiscal year 23 one, but it shows that we had your funding was an annual appropriation that expired on September 30th of 2023. So that's great. What happens? Your funding expires. It expires for new obligational purposes. It doesn't expire though for antecedent liabilities, but we're going to talk about that bad boy in a few more slides down here. But anyway, so your annual will, like I said, expire on September 30th, 2023. GSA then has 5 years to the end of the fiscal years to completely execute the project. And I mean, everything has to be done. All the contracts with GSA have to be, written to the vendors. The vendors have to be paid. GSA has to collect the money from your agency once the billing occurs, and GSA only bills once expenses occur against the RWA. So all that has to happen prior to that expiration date, because if it doesn't, then the money basically poof disappears. It goes back to Treasury. So let's flip to the next slide here. And here's the same kind of chart thing, but this is looking at a multi-year funding source just to kind of explain it. So like I said, multi-year, this particular one's a 2-year. But like I said, I've seen 2, 3, and 5 year multi-years before. So This one will expire on September 30th of 2024. So you might have sent GSA your money in fiscal year 2023, but that period of availability or liquidation period, that clock doesn't start ticking until September 30th of 2024. Now, does that mean GSA is going to take 5 years or take the entire amount of time to do your project? No, it does not. GSA is not just going to be sitting on your projects because, like I said, you have to have bona fide needs and the work's there to get done. So we're not going to sit on the project. But this just kind of explains the funding behind it and why we do basically what we do on getting these projects executed. All right, so we've went through these laws now. Now let's kind of dip into the policy and talk more about the policy and why we have what we do. So a lot of the RWA policy is, like I said, governed by the laws. So a lot of what we have on there is just ensuring that we have internal controls in place to make sure that we are following all the laws and regulations out there, that everything is legal. So let's flip to the next slide here. We do have some substantive changes coming soon to the RWA policy, and there's just a few here. So just kind of want to let you know what's coming like soon, next month, actually, spring of 2024. One is the removal of references to the DoD financial management policy. If you're not a DoD customer in this presentation here, it's probably not going to make a lot of sense, but GSA and DoD for a while did have a mutual agreement on how we would run their projects. So this basically just removes it and puts it back to status quo of how we work everything. This change also raises the single transaction threshold for F types. It was original $25,000 for a single transaction, but it has been raised to $50,000. And a few more slides down, we're going to talk about those F types. So we'll go further into that, but we did make that change. But also another substantial change is we are removing the quarterly billing option. Right now, when you go into eRETA and you create your RWAs and stuff, you do have two options. You can do a monthly billing or a quarterly billing. The quarterly billing will disappear next month. The only option you're going to be given is a monthly billing. All right, so those are the changes, but let's start talking about this policy now. On this next slide here, the first thing we're going to talk about is antecedent liabilities. So I kind of had mentioned it before, so let's talk more about antecedent liabilities. So first, what is an antecedent liability? What does it mean? That's a common question we get about understanding. Basically, a antecedent liability is when we are working a project for you guys and the costs arise on that project for unforeseen conditions, meaning we are still delivering the same scope you asked for. Nothing's changed. We haven't added scope, nothing, but maybe those costs arose. So we need additional money from your agency to finish the project. That is what's considered an antecedent liability. So in examples of antecedent liability, the best example right now, because after COVID and everything, material costs increase. If the project was estimated prior to COVID and we're still working it right now, odds are you had to send an amendment because it's just those costs just went through the roof during that time frame. Or maybe it wasn't the materials itself, it was just the bids coming in from the contractor. They were higher than anticipated, or or it could be unknowns while we're doing the project, like ductwork that didn't show in drawings, but must be accomplished in order to, or must be moved in order to accomplish your desired outcome. That has happened too. Maybe it's just something, it was, you still need this done, but you can't do this without doing this. So that is what's considered an antecedent liability. So like I said, these are all examples of antecedent liability, and they will require an amendment to the RWA. It is important to note here that new scope cannot be added to the RWA past the fiscal year of acceptance, as new scope is not an antecedent liability. Remember, I kind of talked about this a couple slides up. It's just reiterating it now. We can't do it. And it's actually going to be in a couple more slides down, just to warn you here. But it is a common thing, and we get from you guys as our customers wanting to add scope additions after we've accepted the RWA. And unfortunately, if it's past the fiscal year of acceptance, we cannot do it. So, all right, now let's go to the next slide. And let's talk about policy and what we have on full funding versus incrementally funding a project. So incrementally funding a project is prohibited. We cannot fund a project over a period of time. So prime example here, and like I said, it's been asked by us before, your agency has a project need. You've come to GSA and GSA has given you an estimate saying, yeah, we can do this. Let's just take an example of $1 million. We can perform this work for you, but it's going to cost $1 million. Your agency comes back and says, well, we don't have $1 million right now available, but we do have 700,000. So how about I send you 700,000? Let's go ahead and start the project. And the next fiscal year, I'll send you in the additional 300,000. That is considered incrementally funding the project and is not acceptable. We cannot do it, which is why in policy also, we have full funding is required. You must, that's why I said you've got to have that clear scope. You must have that complete scope and provide the funding for the entire project. So if you send in an RWA for carpet and repaint of a certain room, you can't just, provide the funding for the carpet portion, not the paint. We have to have the full funding. And the bottom line behind this is because appropriations law does not allow for agencies to knowingly enter into a contract knowing there is not enough funding to cover the entirety of the project. So it's basically a appropriations law violation by, doing that. All right, so next slide, please, Jesse. All right, so now let's talk about furniture and limited personal property acquisition that PBS can provide. This is a great common question because, GSA as a whole has, PBS and our sister organization, FAS. FAS is usually the one that handles personal property. There are some instances that PBS can actually do this for you. The key here is if PBS is working a project for your agency, it has to be incidental to the project. So the furniture and limited personal property has to be incidental to the project. Let me rephrase that here and I'll explain a little more in a second. So what does it mean by incidental? It means we have to have the funds for that personal property you want. We have to have that RWA accepted prior to the awarding of the general contractor's contract or lease award for performing that work. So the RWA has to come in at that point in order to make it. Now, if the RWA comes in after that point in time, GSA does have limited standalone options for furniture only. So if your agency comes, or I'm sorry, PBS, does have it for limited standalone furniture. So if your agency comes to PBS and says, hey, I really need some furniture in this particular room, but we can't tie it back to be incidental to a project that PBS is working, we might have the option to do it as a standalone furniture. You would really need to discuss this with PBS and the PM that you work with this stuff to see if it's going to meet the limitations to do the particular furniture. Now, there are no options for personal property. So if you standalone have personal property you want PBS to do for the project, there is no standalone options for PBS to do that. You would have to go to FAS. Now, I said limited personal property. So let me kind of explain what I meant by that limited personal property. So furniture is one thing, but limited personal property is when the personal property becomes affixed, connected, or adapted to the building, then that is personal property that PBS can help your agency with. If it's not, say it's a standalone microwave just sitting on top of the counter. That is something that PBS can actually never purchase for you guys, even in an incidental to a project. That is something that you guys would have to automatically go to FAST for. We can only do the personal property itself if it's, like I said, connected, affixed, or adapted to that building. So if you do come across those instances, just please work with FAST, who would be glad to help you with that. All right, let's flip to the next slide, please. And now let's dig into more of the policy here. So we're going to talk about severable or non-severable again, because we're going to talk about this, and then we're going to break out our RWA types and tie all this back to it. But let's start with severable and non-severable, because it's a common confusion question that we get. A severable service is a benefit received each time the service is rendered. So, per appropriations law, a severable service cannot exceed a 12-month period. It can cross fiscal years, but it cannot exceed that 12-month period. So some good examples of your severable services that your agency might come to us for are your overtime utilities, your cleaning. It's anything where benefit is received with every service that we provide your agency. So a non-severable service is the opposite. The benefit is only received once the entirety of that project is complete. It's a single outcome, basically. So I use this example a lot, but if you're carpeting and repainting a room, you won't receive the benefit for the entire room until it's completely done. So we can't just put in half of a flooring for your agency and it's like, oh yeah, you got usable space. No, that is a non-severable project where that benefit is not received until the end of the project. Now with your non-severable services, execution can cross your fiscal years, but must be completed prior to the funding liquidation period of availability, which is that 5-year rule we went over a few slides back. So, you know, PBS is not going to sit on your RWA until the end of that period of availability, but we do have to have it completed within that execution process. All right, let's go to the next slide here, and we're going to dig into the severables a little bit more. And like I said, we're going to separate up by types, and I'm going to kind of explain this to you. So we're going to go through the RWA types that GSA might use. Now, this is good information for your agencies to know, but GSA in the end will make the determination of the type of RWA that will be assigned. But like I said, it's going to be the help with your agency, but it's during initial acceptance process. That is, we're going to determine and figure out, you know, exactly what type of RWA we're going to do. So let's start with talking about R and N type when it's considered, it's for a severable service, basically. An R type RWA is a 12-month life cycle. It is only good for the fiscal year that when it was accepted, basically. So if you send in one now, it's automatically going to expire on September 30th. It's only good for that fiscal years. We use R types when costs are not readily identifiable for the work being done. Prime example here, we have a federal building with multiple agencies in there, and it's not separately metered. So on your overtime utilities, we're not quite sure, you know, who gets what. So that is when we're going to use an R type. And basically, the estimator is going to create an estimate based off of your needs. So that particular building manager is going to come to you and say, hey, how much overtime utilities are you going to need this year? And they're going to plug in the numbers, and it's based off of like last year's spend levels and everything, but it's going to come back with an estimate. R types, you know, come back and actually GSA or PBS, let me rephrase this, actually pays that bill, and the R types come in and reimburse our BA 61 basically that paid that particular bill. It's when we can't separate out those costs and tie it back to you. Like I said, it's tied to the fiscal year. Now, an R type, even though it's severable, and I said appropriations law said severables can go up to 12 months, but can't exceed 12 months. An R type RWA to GSA cannot cross fiscal years. So it's only going to be good from October 1st to September 30th, or whatever your period of performance is for that particular RWA. You might only need you might only need funds for 3 months. that's fine. That would be your period of performance or your POP date, what we call it. Now, we also have N types. Your severable might be on an N type. So like I said, on your R types, your costs are not readily identifiable, but on an N type, your costs are readily identifiable, meaning GSA is going to write a separate contract and not pay a mass bill like we do the R type. So when we have a severable that will have a separate contract, it will get processed as an N type. So N type, again, a severable service N type cannot exceed a 12-month life cycle there, but they can cross fiscal years. As you know, as long as those services are awarded in the fiscal year of acceptance, they can cross fiscal years. So what I mean by that is maybe we take in July 1 from July 1st to June 30th of the next year. That's fine and dandy, but the overtime utilities or whatever contract we're going to write has to be written prior to September 30th, but they can cross fiscal years. That's a key point here. So that explains on the N types. Now, N types are also can be covered non-severable. So let's flip to the next slide here. And let's talk about RWA types and non-severable services. So you technically have 4 different types. 3 are listed here. The next slide, which we'll get to here in a little bit, is the F types. And they're their own little can of worms there. So we have a whole slide for those. We'll talk about those here just in a second. So for your non-severable projects, it can be an N type, it can be an A type, or it can be a B type. So when does GSA, when do we sign which type and when? Well, particularly, let's talk about your B types. A B type will be assigned to the particular RWA when it is related to a prospectus project, and that's regardless of the dollar value. So you might only have to submit in you might have to submit 50,000 to GSA, but it's related to a prospectus project that we're working. That $50,000 RWA would be assigned a B type. A type are for when there's also GSA funding involved, the BA 54 program, which is our repairs and alterations. So it's a government building and we're doing some of the shell work, paying for it out of BA 54, but your agency wants to tack on something else to it. When those funds would be sent to us, we would assign it an A-type number. It just basically tells us that we are also, doing some work against this project. Your N types for your non-severable projects are, your standalone projects for one-time need. I always like to call them the catch-all. They're for everything else out there. They're not associated with GSA funding. They're not associated with a prospectus project, but it's just a one-time need for your agency. So an example is a non-prospectus space alteration project. You come and say, hey, we're in the space, but I really don't like the 4th floor. Can we just do a whole renovation to that 4th floor? We'll do it, and it'll probably be an N type there. So that's your N type. Next, let's flip to the next slide, and let's talk about these bad boy F types that I was mentioning earlier. So F types, they can be for severable or non-severable, kind of like your N type, but they're different because they are designed for miscellaneous work. And they are only good for the fiscal year of acceptance. So like an R type, they will automatically close on September 30th of the fiscal year of acceptance of that particular RWA. They have limitations. So a single transaction cannot exceed $50,000 on an F type. And overall, the total authorized amount of the F type cannot exceed $250,000. So those are some of your limitations. But the key here is if your agency has a specific scope of work, it really doesn't need to be an F type. Those should really be an N type if you have a specific. The F types are designed for like your as needed overtime utilities. You may need some, you may not. but you need to have the money on the books. That's what they're designed for, or even for miscellaneous work. So you have money on hand. Maybe you walk into the office one day and the door lock broke on one of your doors and stuff, and you need that fixed and stuff. You've already got funds on the books, so the GSA building manager can, work fast to actually get that work proceeded and done for you. So, right, that's basically your F-types. Like I said, they have their limitations. Now I'm going to flip it over to Jesse, though, who is going to get more into the processes of our RWA program. Jesse?
Thanks, LB. Hey, everybody. So I'm going to start talking about some of the more process-oriented slides in this presentation. We're going to start here with the eRITA slide. So what does RITA stand for? It stands for RWA Entry and Tracking Application. So yeah, that is an acronym. Well, it's an initials within an acronym, and that's quite the feat of the government agency to get that. What is the difference between the two? Well, they're the same app, but it's two different ways of signing in. So for eRITA, you have your customer access. That's all of you. That's what you access, and that's what you're going to see. RITA is the platform that internal GSA folks use. So in terms of any differences there, you all will have access to eRITA, and you'll be limited to your AB codes. Internally, the GSA folks will be limited regionally. There's obviously other roles within both platforms, but that's not necessarily critical for anyone here to really delve into. So how do you sign up for access to eRITA? I remember in the first poll question, we had something like maybe 60% of you have access to eRITA, and the rest of you did not. So some of you might not need it. Some of you may need it. How do you get that access? Well, gsa.gov/eRITA is going to be where you'll find out that information. Okay, so you go to that URL, and this is what you're going to see. I want to point out 4 things here. Number 1 is that there is a whole litany of training materials on this site. And so that comes in the form of past trainings just like this that we do. These PDF quick reference guides on nearly any topic you can imagine relating to eRITA, and some random just kind of video tutorials on there. So excellent place to look for questions about eRITA. Also, keep in mind, we have eRITA specific trainings that are coming in the future, and that will be talked about later on. So another thing I'd like to point out on this screen grab here for gsa.gov/eRITA is the access instructions. That can be found there on the left-hand side, and you'll find everything you need there to access eRITA, detailed instructions, FAQs about it. Thirdly is to the right there, you'll see the eRITA@gsa.gov email address. So that's a really good, I'm not going to call it last resort, but it's a really good reference for technical specific questions about eRITA. And the reason I don't want to call it a last resort is it is a good reference and you will get a quick answer, but you should always turn to this website here because it is very thorough and I think super helpful. So that kind of brings me to my last point about this website is that you see over on the left-hand side there, the overview and FAQs headings. So much of what you could ask for, related to policy, any types of those questions can be answered here. If you don't need to go, if you want to, look somewhere before you go to your GSA POC. This is a great place, and I would be very surprised if you couldn't find your answer here. Okay, so let's talk about some important distinctions here. This work request versus RWA distinction. So a work request is not an RWA. That's the long and short of it for this slide. That distinction is important. We're not expecting you to be experts in RWA policy and process, but if you can manage to understand this distinction, I think when you're talking about problems that you're having, you'll always have a sort of leg up. So let's talk about what the distinction is. The work request is kind of your initial identification of a need. So that is when you log into Rita and you put in a project, that's going to create a work request. That is not a binding agreement. It is just simply an identification of a need in our system. It gets the ball rolling on the whole process, but don't think of it as the formal agreement that an RWA is. So when you're talking about a work request, there is no policy that applies to it. There's the system itself will govern how work requests flow through things, but it is not an RWA. So when do we get to the RWA point? That happens at RWA acceptance. So we're going to look more so at this whole process here on the next slide. Okay, so what you're seeing here is an overview of the whole RWA process. The big takeaways I want everybody to have here are that you have your initial kind of work request creation, pre-planning, and unassigned statuses. The way that you get out of that initial work request unassigned status is by the customer, you all, sending it to GSA for assignment. So initially we'll focus on that assignment. So GSA may take up to 5 days to assign this. So keep in we'll see on the next slide here what that's going to look like. So this is the email that the customer POC and the other people associated with it on your end will receive when the when the work request is assigned. You can see there that you can have your GSA POC identified. That's your person who you can go to with questions to get the ball rolling on the RWA. Okay, now speaking of that, let's go back to our overview of the process. Okay, so we just talked about kind of your initial outset, identifying the need, your work request. You all kick that over to GSA. GSA takes about 5 days or less to assign that work request to a PM. Now, what happens next? So you can see here in the kind of large block in the middle, planning estimate status, this is going to be the bulk of the work. So this is your requirements, your estimating. This is where you're nailing down your scope. You're doing all your work with your GSA POC. Before we're going to get more into that, we're going to do a quick poll question. So I'm going to kick it back to our CES counterparts here.
All right, thanks, Jesse. We've got a true or false. So you have a 50-50 chance of getting this right. Work request as a formal agreement is a formal agreement between PBS and the customer. True or false? All right, we'll end that poll. And almost 70% said false. Jesse, is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. A work request is not a formal agreement between PBS and the customer. So like we discussed before, the RWA is the formal agreement. And when do you get the RWA? It's at acceptance. So we're going to get more into the nitty gritty on all that soon. So hold tight, but seems like everybody is getting it. So that's great. So let's
Thanks,
get more
Jesse.
into the kind of requirements development and scope development that we were talking about before.
Hey, Jesse, before you begin on that next slide, I just want to make sure that folks are putting their questions in the Q&A pod. I've been seeing some questions wander over to the chat, and that's great too, but in order for our presenters to see those questions and answer those on the fly for you, make sure and put those in the Q&A pod. As far as getting copies of slides, we're getting a lot of questions about those too. Those will be posted, if all else fails, those will be posted on our website as well for the Client Enrichment series. So if you don't get them in your email today, they will be on the website as well. And those get posted fairly quickly. All right, Jesse, back to you.
Okay, thanks. So, okay, requirements development. Like I said, you get an assigned work request, and now it's kind of up to you, the customer, and GSA to get those requirements finalized. So what does that look like? Everybody's going to do it, in terms of exactly how it's completed. Everyone's going to do it a little bit differently, but in general, a couple of things that we're looking for. We're looking to identify the need. What are we doing? Does the customer have specific needs identified already? You should at this point, and we should have that identified on some sort of documentation that we have agreed upon. We need a scope that is specific, clear, and discrete. And LB has kind of harped on this quite a bit. There's a really important reason why we need to have a specific scope, and that's because of the way that our policy operates. We need to have that scope identified early on because our scope is locked after a certain point. Once again, we need to have the schedule and the budget. These are all things that are going to kind of impact how we input certain things into our systems and communicate to you kind of where we are in terms of range of accuracies. So these are all important things. Let's dive a little bit more into the scope quickly, hitting on it one more time, and it will not be the last time in this presentation. So what is an element of good scope? We said this before, but it's an intent, content, extent. So the purpose, what is it for? Is this a renovation of office space? Is this building a new building? Is this installing, EV chargers? We need to know what it's for, what exactly we're looking at. That's also the content. The content is going to be exactly the specifics of things. So like, your electrical specifics, your framing, all those types of specific needs that should be identified in a well-written scope of work. And the extent, this is going to be, I would call it in a way like the boundaries of what the project is. So it's the space, the square footage, the address, things like that. As LB was giving an example before, you can't say we're going to, this RWA applies to room A, B, and C, and then try to sneak in D at the last minute. That's going to be a breach of our policy. And that's why it's so critical to make sure the scope is dialed in. After the first year of acceptance, that scope is locked. And you can't go back except for a new RWA, which we'll talk about a little bit more towards the end of this presentation. Okay, so how do we communicate some of these things in our systems? We're going to talk about the SCE specifically in detail in a handful of slides. But this is how does the RITA system capture some of this cost information and then present it to you all as the customers? There's two different ways. You all may be familiar with them. I think we were something around 40% PMs and then maybe 20% building managers. So if I'm making a massive generalization here, 40% of you probably see the SCE almost exclusively, and 20% of you perhaps see the OUE exclusively, depending on how you dole out your role in your specific agency. So RITA has both those formats. We're going to look at the SCE soon, but just keep in mind that you're going to have a handful of line items included in there. The ECCA, which is the estimated cost of construction at award, the contingency, design, and any sort of furniture, fixtures, and equipment, personal property type things. The OUE includes above standard services, so janitorial services, preventative maintenance, etc. Big distinction to make here is kind of services versus projects. So let's look at a little bit more of what exactly goes into the SCE before we look at the actual format. So one of the big things is direct costs. Direct costs are not covered by the RWA. You will see that in the next slide, how we kind of break out the RWA fee. But some examples of those direct costs are GSA in-house design services. So what is that? An example could be if you are doing furniture for a space and you ask for GSA to design that furniture for you. So that would be what we would call direct cost. Some other examples are in-house M&I services, management and contracting of personal property. So that kind of falls into, like I said, the furniture thing. And then travel costs outside of 50 miles from the nearest GSA office. So if your project is within 50 miles from the nearest GSA office, you're not going to have, those fees are not going to be falling outside of the RWA fee. A lot of this gets very, very specific, and it's not necessarily in our policy to determine it. So we have a link there to the pricing policy, and that's where you can see the kind of the critical breakdown of all these elements and what is covered and what is not. Obviously, you can also ask your GSA PM to do a best shot of explaining it to you all, but I would start with that pricing policy because that will lay it out very plain to you all. Okay, let's look at the RWA fee and how it's broken down. So when LB was talking about reoccurring versus non-reoccurring RWAs before, we had some of this information initially on the slides. The big distinction we're going to talk about in the RWA fee is whether the RWA is reoccurring or non-reoccurring. So what does the RWA fee cover? Well, it's the overhead for the RWA program, systems, and finance personnel. So it's not specific direct labor like we talked about before, but it's more so, you know, the cost to run a massive program. The RWA program took in a massive amount of money last year. You know, GSA is accomplishing a truly tremendous amount of work, and this is how we kind of manage and pay for the overhead of the program. So specifically when we're talking about reoccurring RWAs, it's a flat $500 fee. For your non-reoccurring RWAs, it's a stepped fee. So you're going to see that broken out in your SCE. You'll see how the fee is applied in there. Okay, so before we finally get to the SCE format, this is the email that the customer will receive when your GSA PM POC creates and approves the estimate. So this is what I would say is essentially the end of this requirements development, scheduling, estimating process. You know, you've developed your clear, concise scope. You have created a schedule. You've gotten, you know, whatever estimates you need. It could be It could be 4 or 5 or more. It could be one master estimate. But this is what you're going to see from our system when it says that GSA has finished and approved the estimate. So what does this mean for the customer? This is your turn to take action to get that RWA to its next steps. Before we get to those next steps, let's kind of get in the details of the SCE format. Okay, so I said this enough. The SCE format, summary cost estimate. So this is the first page of the actual estimate itself, the actual SCE itself. There's other tabs there, but they're informational. So just keep that in mind. This is where you're actually going to start to see some numbers being put into our system. So an important thing to remember is that an SCE is not an estimate. The SCE is a way that we capture the estimates and information to be able to calculate the RWA fees that's going to apply, and then obviously to calculate the overall RWA amount. So let's look at some of these we have highlighted here. So we have the ECCA, that's your estimated cost of construction and award. That's your kind of overarching number that you're going to get on one of your estimates. And like I said before, these things could be broken out very detailed. So this is just a certain example. But you have your ECCA there. You have your construction contingency. So all RWAs should have contingency, and we're not going to get into the nitty-gritty here about how these things should be calculated and cost estimating. The thing to know, though, is that it should be there, and there are resources that should help you determine what it could be. 10% doesn't need to be the rule. There are certain ways you can calculate it that are much more in depth and frankly, a better way to do so. That's something that could be seen in the other CES that was done on cost estimating. That gets quite into the weeds on that. So I would highly recommend that if that's something you're looking to educate yourself on. So as we go down here, we see some other line items, design services, CM&I. One thing to notice is that you have in the third column about there a percentage assigned to calculate that. So this is almost in a way like a spreadsheet. You can change the way that that's calculated, that being the GSA PM, but you'll see that can be a kind of indicator to you to say, okay, well, the way that that CM&I was calculated is it's a 6% of line number 3. So you can look there and you can see kind of how that was made up. There's other ways that you can click as the GSA PM to calculate those things. So just keep that in mind. That's how those things are calculated on this form. You'll see there you also have your tenant improvement allowance. That is going to be a deduction from that line 9. And let's go to the next slide here. Okay, so other things here we have GSA direct labor. We talked about that. These are going to be the costs that aren't included in the RWA fee. You'll see that total on that line there. And then the RWA management fee calculation. So something to take away from this is that the location of that line is important. Think of it like a spreadsheet. Everything above that is going to be calculated, and that's where the fee will apply. So on line 22, total project costs, we have $536,000, and the RWA management fee is calculated off of that. It's not going to be calculated off of any potential FF&E we have that's below that. So you'll see there personal property costs, 25, 26, 27. Those are things that will not be applied to the RWA management fee. Quick caveat for that is if that you have GSA doing any sort of labor to design the FF&E, that will be above in GSA direct labor. So say you're spending $10,000 in furniture, but GSA did approximately $2,000 worth of design work. That $2,000 worth of design work will be above, and the $10,000 in the furniture will be below the fee. Lastly, range of accuracy, right below the total RWA costs. It's always good to keep this in mind, that when we are estimating projects, that the closer we get to project execution, construction kickoff, that range of accuracy should tighten. So when you're seeing a ROM estimate from GSA, it is just that. It's going to be a ROM estimate, and it will have a range of accuracy that is different than that one listed on this slide. So keep in mind that the project can change, and that is expected within the construction industry. Okay. So this is some new exciting stuff here. This is our new SCE valid through feature. So communications have gone out about this to customers, and hopefully all of you may have been somewhat aware of it. If not, we're going to talk about it right now so you can be aware of it for when it happens. So firstly, this is going to go into effect on March 16th, 2024. Every SCE, like we talked about prior, and just so you all know, this is the first page of the SCE. Like I said, that has all the baseline information on it, like your range of accuracy, RWA number, etc. So you're going to see an estimate valid through date. Right now, you're not going to see that date on there. But estimates will remain valid for 90 days after they're approved. So what does that mean? You have a GSA PM go into the system. They put in all this information. You know, you're getting ready for a construction kickoff. You're going to award the contract in 60 days. All the estimates are dialed in. GSA PM puts everything in. They click approve. That's going to start the clock. And the SCE will remain valid for 90 days after that. So what if no action is taken within 90 days? Well, the SCE is simply going to revert back to pending. So where it says estimate status there, instead of approved, it's going to say pending. And what is the impact of that? Well, you can no longer fund that RWA. It needs to be revalidated or revisited by the GSA PM and reapproved for it to be funded and moved forward. Why have we decided to implement this feature? It's really just about accurate costs. If we have some sort of estimate in September, and we're not looking to actually fund and approve the RWA until 6 months later in March, is that estimate actually valid? Is that something you actually want to fund? The likelihood of you going back for an amendment to seek more funding, I would say, is extremely high. So the idea here is that we're trying to give you all customers the best chance of having an accurate cost up front. We don't want to have you come back to us for more money at the last minute. This is hopefully some way that we take in an RWA and maybe we don't take in any amendments. Maybe we just have one RWA with accurate costs that are properly escalated over time, and we don't have to revisit it. Okay, so how is this going to kind of play out in terms of notifications and communications to you all? Next slide here. This is a screen grab of the email you will all see. So the people that receive that email about assignment, you're going to see this email that comes to you 2 weeks before the estimate becomes invalid. And what are you going to do when you see this email? Well, you either have to decide to fund that RWA, and then if you decide that you are not able to do so, you can reach out to your GSA PM and say, hey, this estimate is coming on its valid through date. Can you take a look at it and revalidate the costs? Now, say that the GSA PM looks at it and says, everything's great. This was an escalated estimate that took into account timing and the schedule. We're good. All it is a simple click by the GSA PM to reapprove that estimate, and it restarts the clock again. So this really should be overall a benefit. A little bit extra communication between GSA PMs and you all, but that's not a bad thing. This is something that should hopefully increase the accuracy and the quality of the way we take in RWAs in the program. And quick reminder, March 16th. So we're coming up pretty close on that, a couple weeks. Okay, so we just talked about our requirements development scope. We talked about the way that we communicate and compile our estimates in the system, all the fees associated with them. We talked about our new valid through feature. Okay, so we have an RWA, we have an approved estimate kicked over to the customer. Customer is like, hey, let's get this project going. We want to kick off construction in 2 months. Well, what are the next steps? So as soon as there's an approved estimate in the system, it's going to be on you all, the customers, to get the process moving once again. So you all have to fill out the financial information in RITA, and then you have to click in eRITA, send to GSA, and that will officially start the RWA intake process. So what should you expect from this process? Well, we have an overall kind of target of 15 business days. So from the day you submit that RWA, 15 business days for it to come back fully funded and accepted. So if there's errors, expect that you will hear from, GSA in some manner about those errors. And they will reach out to you and help you through the process to get those things fixed and iron out in our system. We're going to talk more about the signatures in a couple slides, so on the next slide. So I'm not going to get too in depth with that, but once you have an RWA that's accepted, once you have that review completed, the next steps are signatures. So until it's accepted, nothing can be done in terms of expensing funds. All right, so RWA signatures. Signatures don't happen in eRITA. So at that initial poll, we saw that, like I said, somewhere around 30-ish% of you all don't even have access to eRITA. Well, if you are the type of customer POC that is signing RWAs, it's not necessary for you to have access, because the way that we do our signatures is through DocuSign. So GSA will route the signatures through the DocuSign platform, and you'll see it via your email. So what's cool about that is that you can even sign on your smartphone, and the customer, you all should sign, will have to sign first before GSA signs. You sign, it's kicked back to GSA, and then the acceptance letter will be coming through the automated system to show you that your RWA is accepted and fully funded. So quick couple of things here about troubleshooting. Like a lot of these automated messaging types of things, it's always a good thing to check your spam on your spam settings on your email, because something from DocuSign may have been blocked as spam in the future. So make sure you're checking that. If you're not seeing it come through, that could be the issue. Okay, so I'm going to kick it back to LB to talk a little bit about RWA amendments.
Thank you, Jesse. Yeah, so Jesse went through some of the process. Now we're going to kick it back to the policy part of it again. So we went through the process of acceptance and getting the RWAs. And so once we have the signed RWA, we have the contract, we have the work to do. So what happens when we need to amend an RWA? So an amendment, your RWA is that contract. So when a modification is done, whether you're changing the scope, and you're allowed to if you're in that same fiscal year of acceptance, or you're increasing, even decreasing funds, an amendment is necessary to modify that contract. You're going to have to amend the RWA for whatever it is. It has to be documented. You know, we went over the documentation evidence and stuff. So it's got to have an amendment there. So what are amendments acceptable for? Administrative changes, that happens a lot. Maybe your agency POC has left the building and you have a new agency POC and you just need to update in the system so the correct person is getting the documentation. That's acceptable. Changes or additions to the scope of work within the same fiscal year of RWA acceptance. We've went over this multiple times. So yeah, you can, during that first year, you can make changes to it. Maybe you need to do a reduction in scope, you know, that can be taken any time to do the reduction out. Or your cost increases attributed to antecedent liabilities. That's an acceptable reason to amend an RWA, any of those things. So what is not acceptable, like we've been reiterating multiple times here, is out of scope changes past the fiscal year of acceptance. So we're in the next fiscal year and your agency maybe wants to, you know, add room D onto that RWA. The answer is no. Even though the RWA is for carpet and repaint, location of D wasn't on the RWA in the first place, which is part of the scope, which validates everything. So it is not acceptable past that first year. Or even extensions of your period of performance dates or your POP dates when it comes to severable services. Severable services cannot exceed a year, key there. So extension of those dates is not acceptable reason for an amendment past the fiscal year of acceptance. So let's flip to the next slide. You know, GSA is running this project, we're executing it for you. And yeah, we've come across, we need an amendment. And so we've got to maybe increase the funds and stuff. So how do you fund the amendments? You know, let's say this amendment is due to, you know, cost increase and antecedent liability that we've kind of already went over. How do you fund those? Appropriations law mandates that antecedent liabilities must be funded with a funding source that was available to your agency at the time the bona fide need was established. The bona fide need was established in this case when we accepted the RWA. So it has to use a funding source from your agency from that time period. So maybe it was a fiscal year 22 RWA. Fast forward today, we need more money in, has to be a funding source available to your agency in fiscal year 22. It does not have to be the original funding source, but it just has to be a funding source that's available to your agency during that time period for new obligational purposes. So what if your agency has absolutely no funding sources available from that particular fiscal year? Well, that's okay too. If that's the case, your agency can submit current fiscal year funding to fund this antecedent liability. However, there is a form that we have that your agency must sign, which is the statement of further written assurance. Basically, it's a form that your agency will sign attesting to you have absolutely no funding available from the year that we established the bona fide need, accepted the original RWA. So in the cases to where we already have the RWA on the books and fast forward a little bit and we need to amend because of antecedent liabilities, then it's either using the original funding, a funding source from when we originally accepted the RWA, or sitting in a current fiscal year of money and signing the statement of further written assurance. So I just kind of wanted to go in and add that in after. Okay, so we went, like I said, we went through the acceptance. This is what we have to do for amendments, and here's why we have to, accept antecedent liabilities the way we do. So that kind of in a nutshell is your process there with the RWA. Let's kick it to the end, closer to the end of this presentation here. Let's go to the next slide, please, Jesse. And let's just talk about the end of year deadlines that we have. Why do we need end of year deadlines? The fourth quarter of every fiscal year is our busiest time of accepting RWAs. The bulk load of our RWAs that we accept and work on are taken in the fourth quarter. So because of that, we do have deadlines. We have to make sure that everything gets done properly prior to the end of the fiscal year. So usually for Economy Act RWAs or something where we're going to use that funding authority, our deadline is going to be sometime in July. And for all other funding authorities, that date is usually sometime the beginning of September. We will issue those dates. I think around the May timeframe is when we'll send you guys, all the agencies, a letter with what our year-end deadlines are, just to let you know. But we have to have a fully executable RWA prior to those deadlines. So what does that mean? What do I mean fully executable? I mean, you've got to have that scope of work defined. It has to have been estimated by PBS. And you as an agency has to, accept it and put your funding on there and submit it or send it back to GSA. So you have to hit that send to GSA button. That is the key there to make it fully executable RWA. A common question is, well, do we have to have signatures on the RWA? No, not at that point. There's not going to be signatures, but you have to meet all those other steps in order for it to be considered fully executable for us to finish it off. And why? That gives us just enough time to finish all those loose ends on the project to get it through the acceptance. Because, depending on your dollar value, it's going to have to go through the review process and other stuff. And, once we do accept it, it's got to get signed too. That's the other key here, is your signatures are not required by that deadline, but they are required before September 30th. Everything has to be signed before September 30th. So that's the key there. And like I said, we have to have the deadlines on there. It just helps us to make sure that, we are getting the projects that need to be put through in the system. So now I'm going to kick it back to James here, who's going to give you guys another poll question.
Hello there. So our poll question, true or false? These are my favorite questions. In order to meet the RWA submission deadline, are signatures required? Uh-oh. The horse race is starting to tighten here. We'll go ahead and close that poll. And Laura Beth, we have almost a 50-50 tie here. It's pretty darn close. True or false? What is the right answer?
The right answer is, to meet the fully executable, no, the signatures do not have to be on the RWA. They just have to be on the RWA by September 30th. So if you wish for GSA to try to get the RWA accepted, it just needs to be submitted to GSA by that deadline, which just means we've done the front end legwork, the scope of work, the estimate, and you guys have funded it and submitted it back to GSA for final acceptance.
All right, Laura Beth, thanks for going over that with us. Kudos to the folks that are answering the questions in the Q&A pod. I see we've had 24 questions answered during this presentation, and we still have another 30 minutes. So please keep those questions going. Our SMEs out there are answering them fiercely as we go through this presentation. So hopefully we get to all those shortly here, and I'm going to pass it over to Jesse.
Hey everybody, so a couple more slides here to talk about. We're going to spend the next 4 or so slides talking about project closeout. There's 2 really important distinctions to make in this kind of heading of project closeout. The first being substantial completion, and the latter being financial closeout. They are very, very different. So let's talk about substantial completion first. Substantial completion, and if you're a PM, I feel like this would probably be something that makes quite a bit of sense to you off the bat, is something that's declared at the beneficial use of the space. So the space can be used by the occupant. What does that mean? So you have a 10,000 square foot office remodel. The space is lit, the space is warm, there's carpet down, there's desks in it, there's internet, but say there's some ceiling tiles missing and there's some baseboard missing, and that would be a space that can be used by the occupant. So it would be substantially complete, and those items, the ceiling tiles, the baseboard, they would be punchless items. So I'm sure you're all very aware of punchless items. It's the handful of things left at the end of the project that need to be done, but your agency can move in and you can start to get your space used again. So we'll look at the letter that you're going to get to signify that you're in substantial completion on the next slide. But just keep in mind, this is not the time where you deobligate things, right? We have punchless items still, so there's still things that need to be done, albeit super small and non-significant, but we cannot deobligate the funding on the RWA. So let's take a look at what that letter looks like. So here's your letter you'll get for substantial completion. You will see at the very bottom there that really important statement of do not deobligate your funds. We are just substantially complete. That is not financially complete. Let's move on to financial completion here. So financial closeout happens when the punch list is complete and the GSA team pays the contractor. So this is when the distinction being that your project is done, but now the RWA, the financial closeout, can happen on this RWA. You're going to get a closeout letter that can instruct you that you could deobligate at this time. So this is obviously very different than the substantially complete benchmark. This is when the RWA can be closed out. Here is your financial closeout letter. It will show you all the financials that you have kind of expensed against this RWA. And at the very bottom there, the deobligation amount. Okay, I'm going to kick it back to the CES team to talk about the Project Pulse survey.
All right, thanks, Jesse. Yes, my favorite survey that GSA does, the Project Pulse survey. So we've been talking about RWAs for the past hour and a half. And so the Project Pulse survey is a survey that we send out to our customers. And there's some milestone points that a survey is sent out to let us know how we're doing as far as running the project, communicating, sending out project schedules, and holding meetings with you. When it comes to RWAs, those milestone dates are at acceptance. So these are for projects greater than 25,000. Expense midpoint for projects greater than 250,000 and at substantial completion. So we also survey lease projects, and we do those at the request for lease proposal, lease award, and lease effective date. So there is a link to the fact sheet on that slide if you want to get more information on those. But I just wanted to take just a minute here just to go over the survey, because we do hold these results dear to our heart, because we want to make sure that we're providing the service that you're expecting from us. And we take all the feedback and all the ratings, and we do share those with the project managers. We share that with leadership. We do not only regionally, but also our headquarters. We're all monitoring the results for the Project Pulse survey. So there is, if you got comments, questions about those, make sure and go to the Project Pulse survey fact sheet. You can also reach out to your project team. Hopefully they're giving you a heads up that the survey is hitting your project, and make sure and fill out those surveys. So I appreciate your time. I'm going to hand it back over to the RWA team.
Actually, James, I think we have a poll question again.
It's a poll question time. All right. So we'll go ahead and launch that poll question for you. As a result of today's session, how much more comfortable are you with PBS RWA processes and policies? And like I mentioned in the beginning of this presentation when I kicked it off, we do have multiple e-RETA sessions throughout the fiscal year, multiple RWA policies presentations as well. And then we have some presentations that kind of mix RWA policy within them. So if this is the first time that you've been in a presentation with GSA about RWAs, thanks for coming. If this is the 100th time that you've seen a presentation on RWA policy, it means we're doing our job and we're getting the information out to you. So appreciate your attendance, and we'll close the poll and show the results. It looks like we're about 88% comfortable, somewhat comfortable. And then of course, we do have a percentage there that needs more information. That's totally fine. That's okay. This presentation wasn't meant to give you every single thing that you need to know about RWAs. We have a team of SMEs. We have a team of folks that are assigned to regions to help out customers with questions. So it's totally fine if you need more information. That's what we're here for. So we'll stop sharing those results. And Laura Beth, I think this is your slide.
Yeah. And just like James had said, we have support for you. So this is a slide just giving you your contact information. And it's geared to which question you have, where you can go to actually get help from us in answering your questions. You know, first and foremost, on the policy and program, on anything we did today, you know, your questions can be directed to each region has their regional RWA manager. Those people are a wealth of knowledge and can help you answer questions. So we do have a link to where you can pull up their map and see who's the RWA manager for which region. You can always email the Ask RWA email. There's a bunch of resources there. But then we also have the web resources. So these are the actual links to the different portals like the e-RETA customer portal, RWA policy guidance. You know, everything I went through on this policy is located on our external site for you, guys, that you can actually see our RWA policy, you know, any e-RETA training guides. It's a wealth of knowledge there. But wait, there's more. The next slide here goes over the D2D stuff, and I'm going to turn that back over to Jesse to talk about real fast.
Okay, so real quick, D2D customer dashboard. D2D is a part of the max.gov site, so you'll need a login for that. But you can click on the link on the bottom there, and that's where you can see our customer-facing dashboard for the RWA program. You can pull and filter lots of great data there. You can download it so you can kind of manipulate it on your own. It's a really great platform. Some of you may use it for lots of other applications outside of even GSA. Maybe perhaps your own agency use it for something, but really great platform to use and manipulate data. And you can show some trends or whatever you want to look into for the RWA program. Okay, one last slide. I'll kick it over to LB.
Yeah, so like I said before in our customer contacts, this is our RWA managers map. Each region has an assigned RWA manager. All these individuals have a wealth of information. It can help you with any questions. I actually started as the RWA manager for Region 6. So I did that for many years before moving to central office a couple of years ago. So these are some contacts. This gives you their email addresses plus their phone numbers. So next slide, please, Jesse. We wanted to thank you guys for attending today's training session. It looks like we have these are the next training sessions out there. We have green leasing requirements. If you guys are interested in that, the client enrichment series will be providing to you guys. Safeguarding assets, risk management for real property, and then even an e-RETA digest is coming up in May. So the website's right there. You can always link back to their website. But other than that, I hope you guys enjoyed today's presentation. Thank you for taking time out of your day to join us. And like I said, we gave you the points of contact on everything. So if you have any questions, just feel free to ask.
Thanks, Laura Beth and Jesse. Any parting comments you'd like to throw out there before I close it out?
Nothing from me. Thanks, James.
All right, and as you see those slides that have the contact information, the emails, the phone numbers, I love how the RWA program is so transparent. These folks actually exist. These are not placeholders on a map or on a slide. So they will answer your questions. And, you know, like Laura Beth said, she used to be our regional RWA manager, and I'm sure I inundated her with questions on a daily basis. And we have some very responsive folks out there. So if you have questions about RWAs, those are the folks that you want to reach out to. Laura Beth did mention the green leasing requirements presentation there. Just to give you a little blurb on that, because that was just added. It's on March 25th or 21st. This is GSA's PBS National Office of Leasing. They're collaborating with the White House Council on Environmental Quality and OMB to develop green leasing requirements applicable to federal agencies that address the EO mandates. Come to this session to learn more about current federal sustainability requirements and guidelines that are being considered as potential GSA lease requirements, as well as implications that these new standards could have on the development of customer requirements and lease terms. So come to those. We've got the Safeguarding Assets Risk Management for Real Property on April 18th, and that e-Reader Digest, I told you that was going to come up, right? That's on May 9th. So to learn more and to sign up for these sessions, go to gsa.gov/CES. The goal of the Client Enrichment Series is to engage our audience in workplace topics that contribute to your mission success and to your effective management of your real estate and workplace programs. Thank you again, and have a wonderful rest of your day.